The winter of 1887 came down on the Dakota Territories like a hammer. It was not a gentle slide into dormancy, a soft blanket of snow over a sleeping land. It was an occupation, swift and brutal. The cold did not knock before it entered. It kicked down the door. It was a physical presence, a weight in the air that made breath catch and steel turn brittle. For the small, hopeful settlement of Prospect Valley, it was a test of a kind they had only read about in letters from the far north, a trial by an ice that was both enemy and cage. The houses of Prospect Valley were monuments to a misplaced faith. They were built from the memories of Ohio, of Pennsylvania, of New York, places where winter was a season, not a siege. They were square-jawed and confident, with flat walls that met the wind head-on, and gently sloped roofs that believed snow was a temporary guest. They were honest structures, built of thick logs, chinked with mud and moss, each one a testament to the hard labor of the families inside. And each one was a sieve. The cold came through the walls, not as a draft, but as a deep and permeating chill that settled into the very timber. It crept up from the floorboards and descended from the ceilings. Frost bloomed on the inside of the windows, then spread in delicate, fern-like patterns across the interior walls, a beautiful declaration of failure. The wind, a constant, shrieking thing born on the vast, treeless plains, treated the flat northern walls of the cabins like sails, pushing and groaning against them, seeking every tiny flaw in the chinking with the patience of a predator. Inside these cabins, life had shrunk to a small circle of shivering warmth around the cast-iron stove. The stove was the hungry god of winter, and the settlers were its frantic supplicants. The piles of wood, which had seemed mountainous in the golden light of October, were melting away like sugar in the rain. Men spent their days wrapped in every layer they owned, their axes ringing against frozen wood, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They hauled sleds piled high, feeding the insatiable beast, only to watch the heat rush up the chimney or seep out through the 1,000 invisible cracks in their homes. It was a losing battle, and the deep heart of winter had not yet even begun to beat. Abel Mason, the community's most respected builder, felt the failure most acutely. He had built half the cabins in the valley, including his own. He built them strong, the way his father had taught him, with tight dovetailed corners and heavy ridgepoles. He knew the craft of wood. But wood, he was learning, was not enough. His own family huddled near their stove, the children pale and listless. His wife stuffed rags into the gaps around the window frames, a futile gesture against an invading ocean. He burned twice the wood he had planned for, and still, the water bucket in the corner of the room was frozen solid by morning. He was doing everything right, everything he had ever been taught, and it was all wrong. This struggle was universal. In every cabin, the same story unfolded. The same prayers were whispered for a break in the cold. The same weary eyes watched the woodpile shrink. The same fear gnawed at the edges of the firelight. They were united in their traditional methods and united in their suffering. They had built a community on the shared belief that hard work and proven ways would see them through. But the land they had come to did not care about their beliefs. It had its own ancient, unyielding rules, and they were failing to learn them. It was in this atmosphere of quiet, freezing desperation that the settlement began to notice the strange work of the widow, Ilara Vance. Ilara was an object of pity and a figure of quiet concern. Her husband, a clever man with soft hands and a mind full of diagrams, had been an engineer back east. He had died of a fever in late summer, leaving her with 2 small children, Leo and Sarah, and a half-finished homestead at the edge of the settlement. The community had offered to help her finish the cabin, to put up the standard walls and roof she would need to survive. She had thanked them politely and refused. Ilara was an outsider in more ways than one. She was quiet where her neighbors were boisterous, observant where they were certain. She did not speak of the ways things were supposed to be done. Instead, she spent the first weeks after her husband's death not building, but reading. She sat by candlelight with his collection of books and journals, volumes filled with strange equations and drawings of bridges, mine shafts, and military fortifications. Her neighbors saw her light burning late and shook their heads. A grieving woman, lost in her memories, they thought. She was wasting precious time. Then, one morning, she began to work. But she did not build up. She dug down. She spent a week with pick and shovel, deepening the shallow foundation her husband had laid, taking it a full 2 feet deeper into the frozen earth. The men who passed on their way to the woodlots stopped and stared. Abel Mason himself paused his wagon. "That's too deep, Mistress Vance," he called out, his voice softened by a genuine concern. "The frost line is deep here, but a man could break his back for no reason." Ilara simply nodded, her face smudged with dirt, and kept digging. "The earth has its own warmth," she said, more to herself than to him. It was a phrase she had read in one of her husband's books, a note scribbled in the margin, next to a diagram of a Russian peasant's hut, half buried in the ground. The real mockery began when she started on the frame. There were no straight, vertical posts. Instead, she began laboriously constructing great, curved ribs of wood. She took young, green timbers, steamed them for hours in a makeshift trough over a fire, and then bent them slowly, painstakingly, around a form she had traced in the dirt. It was a process of immense effort and patience. It took her a full day to shape a single rib. The shape she had drawn in the dirt was the source of the ridicule. It was not a square. It was a long, low arch, like a barrel cut in half lengthwise. A Quonset, her husband had called it in his notes, a design he had seen used for military buildings, prized for its strength and speed of erection. He had sketched modifications, adapting it for a northern climate. "What in God's name is that?" one neighbor asked, leaning on his axe as he watched her. "It looks like a great covered wagon without the wheels." "It's a tunnel house," another laughed. "Is she planning to hibernate like a bear?" Abel Mason came to her again, this time his tone less patient, more insistent. He felt a responsibility to prevent this folly. "Ilara," he said, dropping the formal title, "this will not work. A roof needs a peak. It needs angles to shed the snow. A heavy fall will flatten that curve like a boot on a beetle. The walls must be straight to bear the load. This is a toy. It's a dream from a book. It will not stand against a Dakota winter." Ilara looked up from her work, her hands raw, her face set with a quiet determination that bordered on stubbornness. "The wind will not have a wall to push against," she said simply. "It will flow over. And the snow," she added, looking at the gray sky, "the snow will be a blanket, not a weight." Abel shook his head and walked away, the sound of laughter from the other men following him. The word spread through the valley. The poor widow Vance was building a barrel for a house. It was a tragedy, they said. A woman's grief had unsettled her mind. They watched her work from a distance, their skepticism hardening into a kind of morbid curiosity. They were no longer watching a neighbor build a home. They were watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. Ilara heard the whispers. She saw the pointed fingers and the pitying glances. But she did not have the luxury of doubt. Her motivation was not to prove them wrong. It was the two small faces that watched her from the temporary shelter she had built, the faces of her children. Leo, old enough to help in small ways, brought her water and tools. Sarah, too young to understand, simply watched with wide, trusting eyes. Their survival depended not on tradition, but on the strange geometry in her late husband's notebooks. The mockery of her neighbors was a distant noise compared to the fierce, silent scream of her own fear. So she worked. She worked through the shortening days of autumn, a solitary figure against a vast and unforgiving landscape. The sun would rise, casting her long shadow as she wrestled with the heavy, curved timbers. Her son, Leo, a boy of 10 with his father's serious eyes, became her silent partner. He could not lift the heavy beams, but he could hold a line, fetch a tool, and keep the fire going under the steaming trough. He never questioned the strange shape of their future home. He only saw his mother's resolve, and he trusted it completely. The work was a slow, deliberate conversation with the materials. She was not a carpenter, but she learned the language of wood, its willingness to bend under steam, and its stubborn refusal when rushed. She laminated thin planks together, gluing and pegging them into the arched forms, creating ribs of surprising strength. Each one was a small victory, earned with aching muscles and splinters in her palms. While other cabins in the valley had gone up in a matter of weeks, a frantic race against the first snow, her structure took months to even take shape. As she raised the curved ribs and fixed them to the deep foundation walls, the strangeness of the building grew more pronounced. It looked alien, a smooth, rounded carapace amidst the sharp angles of the other homes. She sheathed the frame, creating an inner and an outer wall, and this was another point of confusion for the onlookers. "She's building 2 houses in one," someone joked, "and neither of them right." But Alara was following a principle her husband had underlined in a book on thermodynamics: the stillness of air. The wide gap between the inner and outer walls, nearly a foot across, she began to fill with insulation. She did not have the luxury of milled wool or cork. She used what the land offered. She packed the space with dry prairie grass, sawdust from the small mill, and thick layers of sod cut from the earth itself. It was a slow, dusty, laborious process. Meanwhile, across the valley, life went on in the usual way. Abel Mason and his crew finished a new cabin for a family that had just arrived. They worked with practiced efficiency, their saws and hammers a familiar chorus of construction. They raised straight walls, set a sturdy ridgepole, and laid a pitched roof, finishing the entire structure in 3 weeks. The new family moved in, grateful and proud, their home a symbol of their place in the community. They looked over at Alara's half-finished oddity and shook their heads, thankful for Abel's sensible, traditional guidance. The contrast was stark. The community prepared for winter with a flurry of familiar activity, stacking firewood high against their straight walls, chinking the same old gaps, banking the foundations with dirt. They were reinforcing a flawed design. Alara, in her isolation, was building a different answer to the same brutal question. Her woodpile was modest. Her focus was not on generating more heat, but on keeping the little heat she could make. The curve of her roof was designed to let the wind pass, not to fight it. The thick, insulated shell was designed to hold warmth like a thermos, not a sieve. The deep foundation was meant to draw on the stable temperature of the deep earth, a constant, low-grade warmth that her neighbors' shallow footings ignored. By the time the first serious snows came, her house was enclosed. It was not beautiful. From the outside, it was a long, low mound, half buried in the earth, its arched roof stark and plain. It had few windows, and they were small and deep-set, like the eyes of a burrowing animal. The community had a name for it now: Vance's Folly. They saw it as a sad monument to grief and foolishness, an ugly duckling in their neat row of familiar homes. They stopped offering advice, convinced she was beyond listening. They simply waited for the inevitable failure, for the day she would be forced to admit her mistake and seek shelter with one of them. The cold deepened. The days grew short and gray, the sun a pale, distant disk that offered light but no warmth. The wind began its winter-long assault on the valley. And then, in the week before Christmas, the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow, and the air grew unnervingly still. The old-timers felt it in their bones. The trappers who passed through smelled it on the air. A storm was coming. Not just a storm, but a blizzard of the kind that became a landmark in time, the kind people would later refer to by its year. It began not with snow, but with a plunge in temperature so sudden it was like falling through ice. The world seemed to shrink and harden in a matter of hours. Then the wind came, a low moan from the north that grew steadily into a physical force, a solid wall of moving air that picked up the loose snow from the plains and hurled it sideways. Visibility dropped to zero. The world outside the window vanished into a churning, screaming vortex of white. The great storm had arrived. For the families in the traditional cabins of Prospect Valley, the blizzard was a declaration of war. The wind, which had been a persistent thief, now became a battering ram. It struck the north-facing walls with a percussive force, a relentless, deafening roar that vibrated through the logs. The houses groaned and shuddered under the assault. Fine, stinging powder of snow, as sharp as sand, was driven through microscopic cracks in the chinking, through the gaps around window frames and door jambs. It appeared as if by magic inside the homes, settling in ghostly white lines on the floors and furniture. The battle for warmth became a desperate, losing fight. Stoves that had been consuming a steady diet of wood were now devoured their fuel with ferocious hunger. Men made perilous, blind journeys to their woodpiles, just a few yards from their doors, and returned gasping, their beards and eyebrows caked in ice, their lungs burning from the cold. The heat from the roaring fires was sucked away almost as soon as it was created. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, their backs freezing while their faces roasted. In Abel Mason's cabin, the strongest in the valley, a layer of ice an inch thick coated the inside of the northern wall. His children were sick with coughing, and his wife's face was etched with a fear he had never seen before. He had run out of the dry, seasoned wood, and was now burning green logs that sizzled and smoked, providing little comfort. He was failing. His knowledge, his skill, his strength, it was all meaningless against this onslaught. Across the valley, it was the same story of cold, fear, and dwindling hope. The storm did not relent. For 2 days and 2 nights it raged without pause, an unholy trinity of wind, cold, and snow. It was an event that stripped away the thin veneer of civilization and reduced life to its most elemental struggle: heat versus cold, life versus death. But at the edge of the settlement, in the strange, low mound of Vance's Folly, the storm was telling a different story. Outside, the wind screamed, but inside, the sound was muffled, a distant, hollow roar. The wind, finding no flat surface to assault, no sharp corner to grip, flowed over the curved roof like water over a smooth stone. It could not get a purchase. The house did not shudder or groan. It hunkered down and held its ground. The snow, which was a blinding, stinging enemy to the rest of the valley, was an ally to Alara. It piled deep on the northern side of her home, burying it almost completely, and settled in a thick, insulating blanket over the arched roof. The snow that Abel Mason had warned would crush her was now serving as a second, perfect layer of insulation, trapping the precious warmth inside. Inside Alara's home, there was no battle. There was a quiet, steady calm. The small stove in the center of the main room burned with a low, even flame. Alara fed it a single, small log every hour, her movements unhurried. The heat it produced was not intense, but it stayed. It radiated from the stove and was held by the thick, insulated walls and the deep earthen floor. There were no drafts. The air was still. The small, deep-set windows were clear of frost. A thermometer her husband had insisted on mounting, a scientific curiosity to her neighbors, registered a steady 60 degrees. Her children, Leo and Sarah, were not huddled by the fire. They were playing quietly on a rug in the middle of the floor, comfortable and safe. The brutal Dakota winter was raging just inches away, but inside their ugly, foolish barrel house, it did not exist. The contrast was absolute. In Abel Mason's cabin, the temperature had dropped to below freezing, despite a fire that was consuming his last pieces of furniture. His family was wrapped in their coats and blankets, their faces pinched and blue. The desperate work of survival had exhausted them, and a grim resignation was setting in. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the air, that they could not last another night like this. His wood was gone. His home had failed. His pride had frozen and shattered. It was the thought of his neighbor's livestock that finally drove him out. He had to check on them. Pulling on his heaviest coat and wrapping a scarf over his face, he plunged into the white chaos. The force of the wind nearly knocked him from his feet. He fought his way to the barn, his body a battlefield of stinging cold. After a brief, harrowing check on the animals, he turned back, but in the blinding whiteout, he became disoriented. He stumbled, falling into a deep drift, the snow swallowing him to his waist. As he struggled to rise, a faint, steady glow caught his eye. It was a light, a calm, unwavering light from a window. He realized with a jolt that he had drifted past his own property and was near the widow Vance's place. The light was coming from her folly. It was impossible. No lamp should burn so steadily in this wind. No house should be standing so quietly. Driven by a desperate curiosity that overrode his pride, he fought his way toward the low mound, which was now almost completely buried in a massive drift. He saw the dark rectangle of the door, sheltered by a small, curved overhang, and he pounded on it with a frozen fist. The door opened, and a wave of calm, even warmth washed over him, so profound and shocking that it felt like a physical blow. He staggered back. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked fire, but a gentle, steady warmth that seemed to emanate from the very walls. He stared into the calm interior. He saw no frost on the walls. He saw no frantic activity. He saw Ilara Vance, her expression calm, and her children playing on the floor behind her, their cheeks pink with health, not fever. His eyes darted to her stove. It was barely glowing, a single log burning with a lazy, hypnotic flame. Then he looked past her, to the corner of the room where her firewood was stacked. The pile was neat, orderly, and substantial. She had used less wood in 2 days of this historic blizzard than he had used in a single afternoon. He stood there, mute, the screaming wind at his back, and the impossible peace of this strange house before him. All his certainty, all his experience, all the lessons of his father and his father's father, crumbled into dust. He had been so sure, so condescendingly, pityingly sure of her failure. And he had been wrong, so profoundly, dangerously wrong. Ilara did not say a word of triumph. There was no hint of, "I told you so," in her eyes. She simply saw a neighbor in desperate need. "Abel," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the storm. "Come in. You will freeze out there." He stumbled inside, and she closed the door, shutting out the storm as if it were a minor inconvenience. The roar of the wind diminished to a distant hum. The stillness inside was absolute. He unwrapped the scarf from his face, his beard a solid mass of ice. He could feel the warmth seeping into his bones, a feeling so welcome it was almost painful. He looked at the smooth, curved ceiling, the thick, solid walls. He looked at the healthy, unafraid children. He looked at the woman who had built this sanctuary with her own 2 hands, against the advice and ridicule of everyone, himself included. "How?" he finally whispered, his voice hoarse. "How is this possible?" Ilara gestured to the curved ceiling. "The wind has nothing to hold," she said, her explanation simple and direct, a statement of fact, not a boast. "It goes over. The snow holds the warmth in. The walls hold the quiet." She offered him a steaming cup of broth, a simple act of hospitality that felt like a profound act of grace. He took it in his numb hands, the warmth spreading through his fingers. He was the master builder, the expert, the voice of tradition. And he was here, a refugee from the cold, being taught the most fundamental lesson of his craft by the person he had dismissed as a fool. It was a moment of utter, humbling vindication for her, and she met it with nothing but quiet compassion. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd day, it left behind a world transformed. The valley was buried under a sea of white, the sky a brilliant, painful blue, the air so cold it cracked and snapped. The sun shone on a scene of devastation. Several barns had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Livestock had been lost, and every single traditional cabin in the valley had suffered. They were battered, freezing shells, their inhabitants exhausted and their woodpiles decimated. The first person Abel Mason spoke to was his wife. He brought her and his children through the deep drifts to Ilara's home. The journey was short but arduous. When his wife stepped inside, she stopped, her eyes filling with tears of disbelief and relief. She felt the calm, steady warmth and saw Ilara's children, and she understood immediately. They stayed for an hour, soaking in the heat, their shivering slowly subsiding. Word spread through the valley like a slow-moving thaw. It began with Abel. He did not hide his failure or Ilara's success. He told everyone what he had seen. He described the impossible warmth, the tiny fire, the mountain of unused wood. He spoke of the quiet, the safety, the sheer rightness of her design. At first, the others were skeptical. They were too numb with cold and exhaustion to believe it. They assumed Abel was exaggerating, perhaps a bit delirious from his ordeal. Then, another family, their own woodpile gone, made the trek to Ilara's home to ask for help. They knocked on her door, expecting to find her as cold and miserable as they were. When the door opened, they had the same experience as Abel, the shocking wave of warmth, the sight of a calm and orderly home, untouched by the storm's fury. They returned to the settlement not just with an armload of firewood, but with a story that confirmed Abel's. One by one, and then in small groups, the people of Prospect Valley made a pilgrimage to the ugly barrel house at the edge of town. They came to see for themselves. They stepped out of the blinding, frozen landscape and into Ilara's sanctuary. Their loud, boisterous voices fell silent as they entered. They looked at the curved walls, touched them, and felt no chill. They stared at the small, efficient stove. They saw the proof with their own eyes. The laughter was gone. The mockery was gone. In its place was a deep, quiet, and profound respect. The structure they had called Vance's Folly was the only true success in the entire valley. A few days later, Abel Mason came to her door again. He was not seeking warmth or shelter this time. He held a pencil and a small, leather-bound notebook in his hand. His face was grim with the memory of his failure, and humble with the weight of his newfound ignorance. He stood before her, not as the master builder advising the grieving widow, but as an apprentice before a master. "Teach me," he said. The words were simple, direct, and stripped of all pride. I was wrong. Everything I thought I knew was wrong for this place. That shape, the thick walls, the snow on the roof, it works. Please, teach me why. Elara did not hesitate. She invited him in and cleared the table. She did not see a humbled rival, only a man who wanted to learn, a man who needed to protect his family and his community. She brought out her late husband's books and journals, the pages filled with his neat handwriting and precise drawings. She spread them out, the diagrams of wind dynamics, thermal mass, and structural loads. She spoke quietly, explaining the principles as she had come to understand them. She pointed to a sketch of airflow over an airfoil. "This is the wind," she said, tracing the smooth, curved line. "It doesn't want to fight. It wants to flow. A flat wall is a fist fight. A curve is a conversation." She showed him the calculations for snow load, explaining how the arch distributed the weight evenly, channeling it down into the deep foundations, making the structure stronger as the snow got deeper. She crumbled a piece of sod in her hand. "This isn't just dirt," she explained. "It's insulation, the earth itself. It holds the warmth of the sun from the summer." Abel listened, his skepticism replaced by a focused intensity. He asked sharp, intelligent questions about joinery, about sourcing the green wood for the ribs, about preventing moisture in the insulated walls. He was a craftsman, and his mind was already translating these new principles into the practical language of saw and hammer. He filled page after page of his notebook with sketches and notes, his pencil scratching in the quiet warmth of her home. He was not just learning how to build a different kind of house. He was learning a new way of seeing the world, a way that worked with nature instead of fighting a losing war against it. The following spring, a new sound echoed across Prospect Valley. It was the sound of change. The thaw revealed the full extent of the winter's damage. Roofs had collapsed, walls had cracked. The settlement looked beaten and weary. But there was no despair. There was work to be done, and this time it would be different. No one laid a square foundation that year. Under Abel Mason's enthusiastic direction, guided by the principles he had learned from Elara, the community began to rebuild. The first new structure was a communal barn, built in the same arched shape as Elara's home. She was a constant, quiet presence during the construction, not directing, but advising when asked, sharing her husband's drawings freely. The men who had once laughed at her now listened with rapt attention as she explained the best way to steam and bend the timbers. The landscape of the settlement began to physically change. The sharp, aggressive angles of the old cabins were gradually replaced by the low, gentle curves of the new design. They were still not beautiful in the traditional sense. They looked like great, slumbering beasts hunkered down on the prairie. But they were no longer ugly. They were symbols of survival, of intelligence, of humility. They were the architecture of wisdom. Each new home, with its deep foundation and thick, insulated walls, was a testament to the lesson they had all learned during the Great Blizzard. The story of Prospect Valley and its strange, warm houses traveled slowly, carried by trappers, traders, and surveyors who passed through. At first, they too would scoff at the sight of the barrel-shaped homes, but their skepticism rarely survived a night spent inside one during a cold snap. They would arrive shivering and leave the next morning with a look of wonder, carrying the story of the widow's folly that had saved a town. The idea spread. In other fledgling settlements across the territories, builders began experimenting with the valley roof, as it came to be known. The design was adapted and improved, but the core principles remained the same. Work with the wind. Use the snow as a blanket. Hold the heat you make. It was a quiet revolution, born not in a laboratory or an architect's office, but in the desperate ingenuity of a woman who chose to trust a new idea over a failing tradition. Elara Vance never sought credit or praise. She remained a quiet member of the community, content in the warmth and safety of her own home, watching her children grow up healthy and strong. When people thanked her, she would often deflect the praise, saying she had simply followed her husband's notes. But the people of the valley knew better. They had all had access to the same wind, the same earth, the same snow. Only she had possessed the courage and the vision to see them not as enemies, but as partners. Years later, when Prospect Valley had grown into a proper town, its streets lined with the distinctive arched roofs that kept its people safe through the harshest winters, the story was still told. It became a lesson passed down to new generations, a piece of local lore that was more than just a quaint tale. It was the founding story of their community. It was a story about the triumph of quiet wisdom over loud certainty. It served as a reminder that the most revolutionary ideas are sometimes born from necessity and desperation, and that the most brilliant innovations can come from the most underestimated people. The ugly roof, once a symbol of foolishness, had become a beloved emblem of resilience. It stood as a silent, enduring testament to the simple truth that nature, in its immense power, is not an adversary to be conquered, but a teacher to be listened to, a force to be understood, and a partner in the simple, profound act of survival.